Okay, so this is the third in our seminar series, and we're really chuffed that Julie Bamford's come down from the University of East Anglia, sorry, if I can say the word, to do the workshop for us today. Julie was kind of crucial in developing the Beacon bid for the University of East Anglia and the consortium which became Q East.
Yes, we were Q East. We've knocked the East bit off now,
So
but we were Q East, yes, for the Beacon.
Community University Engagement?
Yes,
cool.
Yeah.
So, I mean, not only has Julie been working in this area for probably a good number of years, we just say, but certainly specifically around the Beacon project for 4 years, and is now working as Community University Engagement Manager, I believe.
Yes,
well,
yes, at UEA,
in her spare
yes.
time, is doing research in this kind of area, which is why we were very interested in coming along talk to us, partly because she's walked the walk, talked the talk in this kind of area in a way that we're trying to do now, but crucially it's got that kind of research perspective on it. So I hand over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you very much for inviting me as well. Thank you. So, I think this is a slightly unusual format for your talks, but I want to make it relatively informal. But I will sort of provide an introduction, if you like. When we sort of put out the blurb for this session, I think it was in that blurb that we were quoting one of my research participants, a contract researcher. She was then and she is still now. And she was saying it isn't an ideal, or it is an ideal rather, isn't it? This really cohesive university community is going to engage with this really cohesive community out there. And if we're not actually a real community ourselves, then how do we engage with the community out there? So, and this was just this participant thinking about that whole sort of idea of community. So, I put on the tables a flip chart sheet on each table and copies of the poster, which we'll look at in a minute. Rick's already sort of introduced me, and just to tell you that I joined UEA actually in 2005, early 2005, after working for about 19 years in the public and voluntary and community sectors. I had about 14 years of local government, and then 5 years in the voluntary and community sector as chief executive of a charity. So, and I've worked in housing policy, homelessness, social policy, criminal justice areas. So, and also have a lot of experience in terms of voluntary work. But I think it's the experience in terms of partnerships and management that has been of most use, I think, to UEA. And I joined UEA in a new role, which was created for us to liaise with public and voluntary sector organisations. So it was basically my experience that I was bringing to bear on the role. So, and it was back in 2007 that we got the opportunity to bid for Beacon status. And I'd already, by that stage, started an annual community engagement survey at UEA. Some of you will know that universities need to do an annual return based on their interaction with businesses and with communities. And we hadn't sort of completed that part of the return up until that stage as a university. So I thought we ought to really start gathering this information. And we're now in the 8th year of the annual survey. And it's not just this business of counting, which seems very important in terms of identifying the metrics and measuring what you're doing. But also in the very process of gathering the information, you're talking to colleagues, finding out what they're doing, identifying actually an amazing practice at an individual level that in many ways has been hidden. And of course, through our Beacon status at the university, we were able to uncover some of that practice and really sort of recognise the value of it. I think clearly that's what we're doing here with the Catalyst programme as well, which have followed on from the beacons. So what I'd like to do, first of all, I will do a sort of an introduction to the research, and there I've got some exercises for you to do based on the poster. But I wanted to find out a bit more where you're from. We're talking about an engaged research community, perhaps what our idea of that is. But I don't know if you would all consider yourselves as a part of a research community. So I appreciate some of you are from the Catalyst team, and I've met you already. So, but not everyone here is actually from the Catalyst team. So who do we have here who's not part of the university, or perhaps consider yourselves a part of the community or research community?
So I'm part of, I work with Denby School 2.5 days a week and part-time here. So I'm part of the Engaging Opportunities Project, part of the SUPE project, Schools University Partnership Initiative. I'm working with Rick quite closely on the links between schools and the Open University and researchers.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
Okay. So you're very much spanning the boundaries, aren't you? You're spending time, sort of dedicated time in different locations. So yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm Helen Brown. I'm also from Denby School, and my role is research lead in the Teaching School Alliance. And my aim really is to set up research projects across the schools and in different forms, and ideally working within HEI as well.
Yes. So, right. So again, I guess you're working with many different professionals, aren't you? And the students. So it was very interesting actually looking at the blog, the Catalyst blog that you've got, and the stuff that you're doing with Denby, and looking at actually the media workshop looked really amazing, and the confidence levels of the students was excellent after they'd spent time on the workshop. So, are others from the Open University, or you're from? Yes, and I guess you do all consider yourselves to be a part of the research community. So, yes. It may seem an obvious question, but yes, it may seem an obvious question, but yes, depends how you define it. So the workshop today really is based on my research, but of course, and on the experience of sort of co-creating and delivering the beacon at UEA. So I will introduce the sort of the poster, but I want to explain how I came to focus on community engagement, and then we could use the poster just to sort of trigger some questions really that I've got to address to you. So thinking about research communities and focusing on features that you will see in the poster, such as roles, the whole discourse, the disposition of those as a part of that community, the physical spaces, which are important, the whole institutional environment, and think about any other features you really want to bring into the frame. So I've also brought with me copies of a couple of the Q East case study publications, one on public engagement with research, and one publication that sort of came about at the end of the 4-year project, which was looking at the evaluation of all the supported projects that we'd had throughout the beacon. So we felt evaluation was really important, and any project or activity that we supported, we required it to be evaluated. So we had a lot of information and data to look at in terms of how we help to progress the agenda beyond the beacon for public engagement. So, but really, essentially, in terms of both my research, I guess, and in terms of the beacon for public engagement, it's about supporting engaged academic practice. So, now, first of all, focusing on community engagement in the research and how the research question moved to the individual perspective. So my research explores community as perceived by just 12 individuals who all have academic roles at one higher education institution. But all have been involved in community engagement in some form or other, as really defined by the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement. So their description of engagement focuses on the two-way nature of the interaction. What they say is public engagement describes the myriad of ways in which the activity and benefits of higher education and research can be shared with the public. And they say engagement is by definition a two-way process involving interaction and listening with the goal of generating mutual benefit. So is the catalyst working to the same definition? So you are, right, okay. Definitions, I think, are hard, and I think people can get bogged down in trying to describe it. So the definition of community engagement that I devised in my professional role as the Beacon director was actually adopted by my own institution as a part of their academic promotions criteria. So, and what I did in that is look at the variety of interactions between the academic and society. And that definition has 3 dimensions to it. The first one is sort of one way, if you like, and that's what we call communicating knowledge and enriching cultural life. So, and it's the more obvious sort of public lectures, the media work, writing for the non-specialist, very much sort of one-way interaction. So, the two-way part of it is about providing a service and being in dialogue with the public and with communities. So thinking about volunteering, promoting and employing user involvement in research and the co-production of research, right through to pro bono schemes, which, for example, students in the School of Law have actually set up themselves and operate themselves. So, and then the three-way dimension is, of course, involving the academic and the public, but also policymakers. So it's that sort of three-way interaction. So that's where you have the academic working on governmental committees, involving the academic as the sort of expert, but you'll think about some of the larger public dialogue programs like some of the ScienceWise programs. So that is actually a very simple typology of engagement, which we still use at UEA, in our promotions criteria. But we also use it when we're talking to colleagues and to postgraduate researchers and to community partners about trying to identify what we mean by engagement, and to think about ideas and progress ideas for new ways of doing engagement. And I think really much academic practice does actually come within this broad definition of engagement. So clearly all of it's related to the production and dissemination of knowledge. I think, it is a broad church, and that's sometimes difficult for us to work with, particularly from a programme where we're trying to define this stuff and actually look at the practice of our colleagues and to sort of, if you like, sort of make it more systemic, a part of the system of what we're doing. So back to my research, certainly in terms of formulating my research question, I raised a lot of questions that I wanted to investigate, and they reflected my proposal to research the whole area in the context of my professional role. So it wasn't really about the idea of community itself. It was looking at community engagement in the context of the Beacon. So, and also right from the beginning, I looked at it all from the inside out. So what I was doing was really seeking what it means from the perspective of those who were inside the institution. Now what we mean by inside could mean a different thing, so we'll see that when we look at the poster. So, but what I was doing really was drawing on people like David Watson, who is an expert in this area who writes about university community engagement, but he made that essential connection between the practice of community engagement and the need for self-knowledge. So he did say that in order to act effectively in the civic and community arena, a university or college needs to know and understand itself. And he says at a deep and satisfying level, whatever that may mean. But clearly we need some sense of self-awareness. So the title of my original proposal was Culture and Culture Change in Higher Education, focusing on public and community engagement. So whilst I was interested in the perspective of individuals, I still had that interest. My early questions focused on the organisational issues, and these were some of the issues that we were addressing as a beacon for public engagement. Like, what is public and community engagement? Who are the key stakeholders? What does the beacon's challenge mean for higher education, and how should it respond? In very many ways, the whole Beacon initiative was a sort of policy drive towards public engagement in the sector. So, and also asking what we meant by culture in this context. So what are the current values and assumptions about community engagement in the context of the culture of universities? And really, is culture change necessary? So they were the sort of questions I was asking early on in the research. But I didn't entirely ignore the individual perspective in the proposal. So I was really thinking, well, is there a divide between the Beacon funders' aims, that's that policy drive to culture change, and how engagement is actually perceived by individual academics? And if there is that divide, then what are the implications for the culture change that the policymakers were trying to drive through? So I raised more questions before conducting my pilot data gathering. So really I was looking for ways in which I could research the way in which academics conceive of and relate to the whole thing about public engagement in the context of their academic practice. And I wanted to see how I could embed and explain not just institutional actions, but also individual actions. But it was my final data gathering in 2010, which, my pilot data gathering, in 2010, which led me to finally decide on a research question that opened the way to a more in-depth exploration, really, of the subject from an individual perspective. So, and I was asking, how do academics conceive of and relate to the idea of community? My pilot data did actually confirm how subjective and diverse those perspectives and experiences can be, both a community and a community engagement. And also really how important life stories are to defining community engagement, even within the context of a professional setting. So when I asked the academics that I was working with as a part of the pilot data gathering exercise, which was through a life writing workshop, I asked them about community, and they used words like network, school, public, healthcare, responsibility, village, care in the community, unity, belonging, exclusion. You can feel quite excluded. And then they said, aren't I that community too? This is the university. They want the children to come here, the public, but not women with pushchairs, not the men who smoke outside the betting shop. And they said, community, its virtues trip so easily off the tongue. Any one person has multiple identities. Community is a set of complex, interconnected networks. It's not concentric circles. And on engagement, they moved much more to the institutional context. They said, well, engagement is institutionally defined. When I think of engagement, I'm at work. It's done by professionals to people, demanding that I be the expert. But then they say, well, I'm being too flippant. It is also about showing people that they have a choice, that knowledge is available. And then someone said that engagement can mean, for them, a man who lives by the roadside and makes tea for the passers-by, getting through 7 kilograms of tea a day, someone who understands thirst and what the people need. And they said, when I think of engagement, I think of people in town hall meetings, making decisions about preventing accidents. I've moved 7 times. Community is much broader, a mishmash of communities, and I want to be part of a community. But then in the professional context, sometimes I can be frightened to engage. I don't feel strong or confident in myself, and the challenge can be too much. And someone said the process of engagement requires a stillness and an awareness. Now, that was from the pilot data, and I have now completed the main data gathering, which comprised a series of extended conversations and 2 focus groups. So that's the sort of stage I'm at. I did develop a theoretical model in order to analyse the data, and probably some of you will not be surprised that in terms of my research, I chose Bourdieu's reflexive sociology and relevant concepts of identity as a broad philosophical frame of reference. So that was quite important to me in that in some ways they provided me with, of course, an analytic lens through which I can really embed the individual academic perspectives on careers, on day-to-day lives, in the broader structures of the field, that is the institution and the sector. But also because they enabled me to utilise the concept of identity as a social as well as an individual construct. So, and I think that's pretty important in the way that Henkel describes, you know, individuality and the collective, past and present. But finally, really in terms of the need for reflexivity, because working in the field myself and being an insider researcher, it was really critical that I looked at and employed the notion of reflexivity. So when encoding the data, I did actually sort of look at a number of questions. How do academics conceive of and relate to the idea of community? I started asking, does community capital exist inside higher education? And if so, what does it comprise of? But also, how might it be accumulated and utilised, and by whom and to what ends? And what conditions are necessary in order to realise and reproduce community in a university environment? So, what I'd like to do now is turn to the poster, and I put copies of the poster on the tables there. So if I could tell you a little bit about the poster, and then I'd actually like us to do a couple of exercises. So, because I didn't want to talk for too long, and I'm very conscious that I've been talking for a while now. So the poster, Communi-tea party at the Academy, a cutout kit for you to assemble. I devised it for last year's Society for Research into Higher Education annual conference. So, and I've already established, of course, that individual perspectives and experiences of community and of community engagement are subjective and diverse. But in fact, being connected to or being part of the university community, the status and strength of those connections, and indeed the durability of the community itself, did appear to be significant for many who are in, but also those who are around higher education. So when invited to talk about any aspect of community, all my participants decided to focus on the university community rather than anywhere else. So they did occasionally refer to experiences outside of community outside the university, but more often than not, they referred to others who were not necessarily formally members of the university community, but whom they considered to be a part of their research or teaching community. And that's where it does get very interesting. So, and I think this was really evidenced by aspects of their academic practice that could clearly be categorized as community engagement. For example, collaborating with an expert patient who's acting as a co-investigator in their research project, or involving service users in their teaching. So really all my participants had been involved in community engagement in some form or other. So in the context of the sort of discussion that we're about to have in today's session, the question that I'm really asking is what makes for an engaged research community? Now, is being connected to or being a part of the university community, is the status, the strength and durability of those connections, is that vital to engaged academic practice? And is community actually a good thing, something we should strive for? You'll see on the poster there's one quote where somebody says that community doesn't serve people, it doesn't support people, it can be very excluding. Now, I've interpreted community as a relational phenomenon. Of course, I'm exploring and interpreting individual actions. I'd like us in a minute to look at the infusions part of the poster, but just to mention Ron Barnett, who did actually label academic community as what he called a pernicious ideology, along with entrepreneurialism, competition and quality. And he says that that the academic community, it's in its interest to convey the impression that it is a community, when its actual dispositions and indeed its behaviours can be quite to the contrary. It can take a pernicious form. But he also says it could take a virtuous form, which is something we could look at in a moment. So, but the dispositions of my own participants varied very widely. Now, what I'd like to do is, if we could look at the infusions section of the poster, I've given you a flip chart to sort of jot some things down, but what I'd be very interested to hear is, are you surprised by any of these? Would you challenge any? And is there another blend? If so, what? So if you could take maybe sort of 5 or 10 minutes talking in your groups about those. We will be looking at other aspects of the poster as well, but then we could feed back generally. But let's look at the infusions first. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about those and the way they're put together. Okay, it's Rick. Yeah. Okay, right. If we could sort of feed back as a whole group, so were you surprised by any of these? Or?
We call the extreme ends,
yes.
Extreme ends of the scale.
So how would that change the blend, so to speak? Because they are blends. But of course, as you say, there are extreme scales. You could blend the extremes, couldn't you? So, would you challenge any of those, or you?
I'm not sure what we would challenge. One of the things that we came out was, you said that maybe there's missing the instrumental perspective.
Right.
Rather than doing it just because we have to do it.
Right. Yeah.
You go along with things because it's what majority go along with, so you don't want to be seen to be different.
It's what's expected of you.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's also I think that you've got marginalised and disengaged, but marginalised means somebody's marginalising you, so it's what the community or others are doing to you.
Yes.
Being disengaged is more what you do, your choice.
Yes.
And so it's these things about your power relations as such that your position is such that you freely go into this and you're enthusiastic to do so, because you could be well disposed towards it, but you might not, for many other reasons, be able to do much about it. Because your other activities, your other workload is such that, oh, it'd be nice to be able to do more of it. Oh, there's no way I can do it.
Yes, I had a colleague who retired recently and said, gosh, I finally get to do something properly. But you said you're disposed as well in terms of, it's about your position, isn't it, in relation to what's happening at the time and organisationally, though, as well as individually. So, yeah. But, what about those of you who are not part of the... I say not part of the university, you know what I mean, but yeah. But, so, do you have any thoughts?
I think you could probably apply these to all sorts of people, not just to, you'd get these sorts of people and sorts of attitudes at some level in the school or...
We also talked about how people might be different blends at different times as well, that was more generally speaking.
Yeah.
Nothing that's applicable to school or university community.
Yes. And I found that with my own participants, actually, because it was over a period of about 2 years that I was talking to them, and their status is very important, and particularly if you're something like a contract researcher and you have a short-term contract and you're worried about the future. There were 2 of them that moved from contract researcher to a lecturer post, and of course their whole disposition changed. There were many different issues that they were facing, but it was, so I think at certain stages of your career and particularly your status is important. So to the way you respond to what's happening in your immediate community, if you like. And so that's a really good point. So,
a question related to that. If you were looking at a period of time over a couple of years, did you perceive there to be change in discourse that participants were engaging in or wielding over time due to increased sort of awareness of public policy in this area, or the institution becoming more interested in community engagement?
Yes, and that's...
There were structural changes happening.
Yes.
Did their discourse reflect that over time?
In some ways not, and what's really interesting in terms of my position as the insider researcher is that the institutional discourse, or the sort of institutional narrative about community engagement was a narrative that I was writing and in my professional role. So, I've got sort of examples in a moment in terms of the academic practice, and actually the way engagement is embedded in their academic practice and has been for many years. And actually they don't feel so connected to the institutional narrative on engagement and actually struggle with it. And that was an interesting dimension in terms of my own research, because there was one point in one conversation I was having with someone, and they said to me, well, how do you feel about the institutional narrative and what it says in the corporate plan? You know, do you struggle with the definition of engagement that is being portrayed here? I do. Do you struggle with it? So, and that's an interesting position to be in, of course, as a researcher. So that's where the sort of connection, if you like, between the research and the whole Beacon project was an interesting dimension. The fact that I was a part of a policy drive. And I have always described the Beacons for Public Engagement as a governmental intervention, which is not something I think necessarily that all colleagues will appreciate, but that is how it felt sometimes. So, but what was really illuminated by my research is that actually it doesn't matter, that policy drive is there, but in fact they're at an individual level, in terms of their academic practice, these people are engaged. They are, the values that they have at an individual level are very closely related to the values that we are trying to bring about, or the values that we have in terms of progressing the engagement agenda. So, which was something, in a way, something very optimistic that was brought out in the research. So, and I mentioned that Barnett described academic community as a pernicious ideology. So, but he does say that it could be turned into a virtuous ideology, and I think that is where this sort of discourse helps enormously in terms of thinking about that. So, and that does actually reflect my own motivation to undertake the research in the first place. So, and there were my participants who actually said that they wanted to participate in the research because they wanted to have a greater sense of community at their institution, and they thought that this might help to bring it about. So even though in a sort of I'm still broadly researching the role of engagement and the culture of higher education in that sense. Philosophically, I am actually committed to the whole idea of community university engagement, and indeed to the public role of higher education. So, and that is something that I, of course, recognise in terms of my research and in terms of what I'm writing up at the moment. But it's, that's perfectly all right. So. But I'd like us to look at the roles on the poster in a moment. But I think, again, thinking that my research is about academics, because it's just 12 academic staff that I'm talking to. And that's academic in the broadest sense, because I've talked about, contract researchers, early career researchers as well. In fact, they've spanned from early career researchers right through to emeritus professor. But it's interesting that a note that just a comment made by someone called Peter Taylor, who's written about actually making sense of academic life, and he suggests that academics have to learn to work with what he describes as two publics, the general community and the disciplinary community. And of course it's not quite, as divided as that, but he does say that they actually have to live by two sets of rules. But of course, back to my pilot data gathering, one of the participants said, well, I'm part of that, I'm community too. So it's not necessarily that divided. So, and in fact, Taylor sort of thinks about it in terms of layers or sort of levels of academic identity. So, and I think the whole identity can mean many different things. So, well, what I'd like to do is, if you could sort of talk in your just small groups again, just looking at the roles here. Do you recognise these roles in relation to yourself and others? And if so, perhaps when have you been in these roles or sort of seen examples, and would more than one apply at any one time? Would you add any roles, or do you feel that there are those that don't belong here? So these are all roles that were ascribed by my participants to themselves. And also in terms of thinking about their research community, but there are roles here that you wouldn't necessarily think would apply to the academics. So,
Is there roles with respect to research in some way?
yes, it's thinking about their roles with respect to their research community, or research and teaching community, actually. So, yeah. So just spend a couple of minutes thinking about that. Okay, I'm just conscious of time, so if we just feed back on that for a few minutes, and then I'd like to share with you a little bit about aspects of the academic practice, and then we could just sort of finish up on a conversation about the quotes and the conversation pieces. So what are your thoughts about the roles described on the poster? Do you recognise them? You don't have to name people, of course.
No names.
But,
I thought there was one missing, which was there's no mention of student.
yes.
Up until last year, I would have identified myself as a student,
Mm-hmm.
and yet still part of the university community.
Yeah, I think that is interesting in terms of, it's obviously just 12 academics I was talking to, but
sure.
they were teachers as well, but they didn't necessarily see the students as a part. It's interesting because they did actually ask, in the focus groups, they were saying, well, we would really like to have this conversation with our students. We'd like to know from them what they think about community, what they think we should be doing about creating a greater sense of community for them. So I think that's a really good point. I think, students.
We had a conversation about the role of sort of being credible in a practitioner community and in an academic community, which might be a bit like, notice your marginal nature because the only one is a different colour.
Yes.
But it's somebody who can who can be comfortable in a professional society.
Yes.
A group of professionals and an academic.
Yes. Yeah.
I suppose related to that, I was wondering if you did this as one of those little drawings you do as children, where you start amazing or whatever. Is that the start point and then
Yes.
Hiking is calm.
Yeah, so you always go around things, can't you?
I do. Have you heard of the work of some of you will know Celia Whitchurch's work about the identity of third space professionals in higher education? So it's very interesting. So these people who do actually are comfortable in these different spaces that you described. So, yes, yeah.
Sorry, is that obvious? We were just having a discussion about the significance of the symbols, as it were.
Yes.
Female, male, or and I noticed, and you said it was only from 12 academics. So is it the case that they describe themselves as a non-academic and sometimes as an academic role? I'm assuming
yes,
the one with the hat.
It is actually in a sort of non-academic role and an academic role. But just thinking about the role of volunteer, for example, the person who described themselves as a volunteer, they were a researcher, but they would go and volunteer in local community organisations as a part of their research and as a part of getting to know people who were participating in their research and also recruiting research participants. So I think that's quite an interesting area in itself, that our academic colleagues will participate in community engagement, even sort of act as trustees or act as volunteers, and sometimes that volunteering role is independent from their university role, and actually they want to keep it separate. But this happens to be an example of somebody who was very much using it as a part of their, if you like, their research identity and using it in their research practice. So, so I guess it's the motivation for the volunteering is interesting there. So, yeah. yeah.
Also, policymakers and funders aren't
yes.
either, and I just wondered if anybody's mentioned those as people that they converse with or aspire to converse with, given your typology.
Yes, I think they would. They would. These are roles they sort of ascribe to themselves, but yes, I think they would. And there, some of my participants have been very much involved in sort of policy making. So, to the extent, I think one has a ref impact case study. So, you know, it's clearly sort of, if you like, it has sort of been sort of very influential, I guess. But I think, yes, I think when the interesting thing about this whole exercise, I think, is that you could look at the wider community. You could talk to all of these different groups and see how, you know, how they would contribute and be a part of the research and teaching communities. So, but engaging with policymakers is, of course, a part of that typology. So, yeah. So, I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to have a look at the conversation pieces. Before we do that, I've just wanted to tell you a little bit about what my participants were actually saying about their own sort of values about community at an individual level, which did actually manifest themselves in their academic practice. And I think it is that link back to academic practice that is sort of quite crucial in terms of thinking about how community sort of is manifested, if you like. So, and this came very much from all these points, what they made about their own practice. So, and what they say is that they do try to understand how people outside the university may feel, and one thing they do is they try to bring the voice of the community into the institution, into the university environment through their research. So, and they feel it's very hidden. They say that they engage with those hidden voices and experiences. So, and what they do is they actually knock on the door and they ask people what they think. And this is the broader community. So, in terms of their own community in the institution, what they do is that they do spend time and effort in creating and sustaining what they describe as a learning community by cultivating a very collective practice at a team level. So again, it's not thinking about the institution so much, it's how they operate within their own teams and how they manage their teams. And they see their teams as including people who are not necessarily employed by the university, those members of the public, for example, that help them with their research. So, but they also spend a lot of time mentoring younger colleagues in a sort of non-line management way. So, and they say that in doing so, they're really rewarded with a greater understanding of their own academic practice. So, but on the other side, they do have a very strong sense of the boundaries and roles with which we all sort of operate, and they understand that there is a need for hierarchies, but their view of hierarchies is that every level should work as it should do. So it's understanding that there is a need for, if you like, a sort of in terms of decision making, but there's a certain way in which it should operate. So, and a lot of the stories I was gathering from my participants was that it wasn't operating in a way they felt it should, and actually with a greater sense of community, it could work so much better. So, but where they get their real sense of community, their sense of value and belonging is actually through their research and through their academic practice. So just to sort of wrap up really, if we could look at the conversation pieces, there are a lot of issues being raised in these quotes, and I appreciate this is sort of quite a short session, but and it's quite a big thing to think about, but I don't know if you feel these issues are typical. Would you expect to hear them in your research community? Perhaps you wouldn't hear them, perhaps they're hidden anyway. It may be that those issues exist, but they're not voiced. So let's just spend a couple of minutes in your groups just thinking about that, and then we can sort of feed back and close. Unfortunately, we need to finish at 12:30, don't we? So, yeah, okay. Okay, we've got a few minutes, so if we could just feedback on that, and I guess in the context of these conversation pieces is thinking about that question of, you know, so what are the building blocks or the ingredients, if you like, for an engaged research community? So, and how might we sustain that? So, but and what are your thoughts about the quotes and the conversation pieces on there, and what they're raising?
Well, they're very disparate.
Yes, yes.
So some seem to be implying that somebody else should be taking responsibility for a sense of community.
Yes.
And some seem to about wanting more community within the academic sphere. Some may be about more engagement with non-academic spheres.
Do you think it's that, what we were saying earlier about the difference between the individual perspective on the community and the institutional perspective? That, you know, someone saying our sense of community is too big here. There can be a lot of grand narrative about community, and people don't necessarily feel connected to that. But there are a lot of different issues raised here. So yeah.
This feels like quite a threatened community when I read.
It feels like a threatened community. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
We talked about the multi-layers of definitions of communities.
Right.
Being like, give an example about chemists, you're like part of the chemistry, but then
Yes.
departmental communities and things like that.
Yes.
And my point is that maybe some of the negatives here are the conflict between the perception of the communities that you belong to that aren't necessarily created by the institution, and then how they conflict with what you said was the statement of what the institution is.
Yes, what they're saying. Yes, we are a community of scholars, but what does that mean? And that's the sort of thing you would find in a corporate plan or something, but it doesn't actually mean anything. So,
I was thinking that one, it says the more strongly we cherish something, the more easily it is to use it against us.
Yes.
Seems kind of
Yes.
But it's curious in relation to, okay, if you asked these people to define the community that they value within the institution, right? So do they value the institution, or is it that they value something smaller than the institution? So I value my faculty, or I value my department, or I value my research group, I value my office space. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Is there anybody here you value? Or
Yes.
it's I mean, the kind of take that the other way and say, I was kind of conscious about quote about that sense of community is too big here, which for you is an issue for me.
Yes.
We have so many different communities.
Yeah.
One of the challenges for us is to kind of make sense of that in relation to public engagement, community engagement, national, local, regional, all these things. You know, I mean, we tend to define ourselves. Other people trying to make themselves in the sense of that kind of values around social justice and openness are two big things, which probably all sign up to, I think, here. I put that not being there in front of the camera, but yeah, so that kind of takes you to a community rather than defines the community.
I guess in some ways it gives you a framework within which to work, doesn't it? So, and you need a framework. So, and you can't sort of tackle everything. Though I think when you're starting on a big project like this, there is that expectation and managing the expectations, which for the Beacons for Public Engagement was a big issue. And we had a very different funding actually. We had funding for 4 years, and it took a year to recruit the projects. We went through various stages, but it was that expectation of the culture change, that you will change the culture of the sector in 4 years. So, but there are certain things you have to pick on something, and of course if it's most closely related to your values, then that goes a long way. And I think that's for my research participants, it's that it's what relates to their values as individuals. So, what about the physical spaces thing? I thought that was a really interesting issue that they raised about the social cement. Does that resonate at all?
I think it's really important actually. I think all sorts of things. I think having a space to work together creates a community. Because you get a lot of informal conversation and dialogue and support. If you don't have that, then you're in your room and it can be very easy to become isolated. And also I think if your room isn't, your office space is not congenial or pleasant, then it affects the way you feel about being there.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to be luxurious, but I think I think it affects the way you feel about your life.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about how the sort of physical location is constructed in terms of you just reminded me that one of my participants said that well actually academics spend a lot of time in their monastic cells and actually they don't want to come out and they don't want to go to meetings and they don't but it was something that I said to say yes but and of course one thing I found in the Beacon role, sort of working with lots of different universities, is that every university is different, but the physical space and the way it is built, and with this university, there are actually lots of little small rooms that individuals occupy. And actually there was a moment a couple of years ago when the whole computer system went down for a while, and this is something my participants were describing, and they said it was great because we all came out of our rooms and started talking to each other. So, it's really important. So I'm looking at some of the sort of newer institutions. I was looking at, it's Anglia Ruskin, not that that's a newer institution, but they've got quite a new part of their campus in Cambridge. And I did notice all the areas for conversation and gathering, in the new part of the campus. There's some really nice sort of clusters of where people were sitting and conversing and it's somewhere for the students to go in between lectures and to, and actually, but staff were using them as well. So I think that space is really important. So
it is interesting. I've worked with different parts of the university, different cultures, depending on where you are in the university. But do you know what I mean? There are parts of the university where they do, you go into your monastic cell in the morning, you might come out at lunchtime and do it in the afternoon. You can't run in now. Everybody stops at least twice a day and goes and has a cup of coffee together. There's nobody blows a whistle. You know what I mean? It's not a real rule or anything. People just do it. And you have this kind of nice. There's a lot of social cement there. You know what I mean? I don't know whether it feels like that at the staff room in Denby or not. I don't know how.
Yeah, quite often.
But it makes a difference, to actually say, this is fine. We don't have to think about work. We talk about work.
I think at Denby we have it's organised in faculty teaching spaces, and I think that there's usually a common work area for the faculty, and physicality of those spaces has a huge impact on the way that teachers work, because they'll share ideas and they'll talk about things that have happened and then they'll advise each other and help each other. And it's all informal, but I think it has a huge impact on what they do in the classroom, because they'll talk things through, or something will go well and they'll share it, and then somebody will say, oh, I'll do that, and they'll adapt it, and that's how practice evolves, but it's not regulated. It's there because of the proximity and the roots, and that's very important.
Well, maybe it's a good thing that it isn't regulated in a way. Just thinking about that space, that space for being creative, and which, in a way is, in the context of the university, is, that space should be there, not just in the mind, but physically as well. So, but, I'm conscious of time, so you've all been guinea pigs, but this is the first time I've tried using the poster as a way to sort of trigger a conversation about some of these things, and I very much appreciate your involvement. I think it is a really interesting area, and I think it's something that really we should explore with my other people. It's not my own participants, it's just 12 individual academics sort of working in very different disciplines at different levels of their career. It would be an interesting conversation to have with students, with community partners, really sort of across the sector. So, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.